Hello and welcome to this lecture video. In this lecture video, I'm going to be discussing process costing. I'm going to give an overview of process costing. I'm going to talk about how process costing is different than job order costing, but also how it's similar to job order costing. And I'm also going to go over some key terms and concepts in process costing. So this video is more of an introduction to process costing. If you're following along in the course pack, I'm on page 137. Okay? I'm going to flip the page over here. When we look at process costing, page 138, we're talking about using process costing when we make large quantities of an identical or a similar product. That's the first characteristic of process costing. The second characteristic of process costing is that we would track cost by department. The third characteristic is that products go through a continuous and uniform production process. Okay? So let's kind of talk about these in a little bit more detail. And one example of a company that would be using process costing would be a soap manufacturer. There are different types of soap. Lavender soap, vanilla soap, for example, but they're still soap. It's similar products. Okay? So a soap maker would be using process costing because they make soap, which is a similar product. Even though there's different types, it's still a similar product. The other thing is with the soap makers, they would be tracking cost by department. So if they have a mixing department in which they mix the soap, and then maybe a packaging department in which they package the soap with the nice bows and everything, they would track costs. Here's our overhead, labor, and materials in mixing, and our overhead, materials, labor, in packaging. That's how they would be tracking their materials, labor, and overhead, which are their costs, the categories of costs, but they would be tracking it by mixing department and packaging department, which is different than job order costing. We call them job order costing, we track the cost by job. Also with job order costing, we are talking about making very different products to customer specifications. Here we're talking about making large quantities or identical or similar products, okay? And we track the cost by department. For example, the mixing department and then the packaging department. The other characteristic about process costing is that products go through a continuous and uniform production process. So getting back to the soap idea, if we make soap, we would say all of our soap has to be mixed and all of our soap has to be packaged. Okay? Some similarities between process and job order costing. The first one is that we could say we have the same basic purpose, which is to assign materials, labor, and overhead to the products that we make. So remember job order costing and process costing. These are both called product costing systems. They're both types of product costing systems. Product costing systems, okay? With job order costing, remember we're looking at different types of products made to customer specifications and tracking the cost by job. But it's the same, but even though they are different, right, they still have the same basic purpose, which is that they're both product costing systems, which means we use these two systems to assign materials and labor and overhead to the products that we make. Also keep in mind that product that we have our job order, and then we have our process costing system up here. These are two ends of a continuum, okay? In reality, a lot of companies might be over here, or they might be over here, or they might be here. They could use some forms of job order and some form of process in some type of a hybrid system, okay? But for the purposes of this course, we're either saying your job order or your process, okay? But they do have the same basic purpose, which the product costing systems, we assign materials, labor, and overhead to the products that we make. We also have the same manufacturing accounts. We use under our manufacturing overhead account. We also have our raw materials account, just like what we had with job order costing. We have our WIP, our work in process account, and we also have our finished goods account, and of course we also have our cost of goods sold account. So similar manufacturing accounts. Manufacturing overhead, raw materials, WIP, and finished goods. And then finally we can say the cost flow of costs is the same. Remember, we have our costs, and those go from raw materials to WIP, and then WIP to finished goods, and then hopefully you remember from finished goods, once we sell it, moves from finished goods to cost of goods sold, COGS, cost of goods sold. So the cost flow is also the same. Raw materials to work in process to finished goods once it's been finished, and then once it's been sold, it moves from finished goods to cost of goods sold. Okay? So now let's talk about a few differences between process and job order costing. And I kind of already alluded to some of these, but I'm going to go into them in a little bit more detail. This table here in your notes does a good job of distinguishing these two. So let's go ahead and complete this table based on the differences between job order and process costing. We talk about the number of products, or the types of products that we make. When we talk about job order costing, we're saying we have different products, many different products. Over here, we're saying identical or similar products, right? So probably you could say many products or just a few products, okay? How do we track the cost? How do we track the costs, accumulate the costs, or track the costs? Over here, it's by the job, why it's called job order costing. So we track, getting in a little bit more detail right over here, what costs are we talking about? Materials, labor, and overhead. We track materials, labor, and overhead by the job. Over here, it's by the department, by our processing department. So going back to that soap example, if we have a mixing department and a packaging department for soap, we would be tracking our materials, labor, and overhead. How much of the materials, labor, and overhead went to mixing? How much of it went to packaging? And so we'd be tracking it by department. In terms of the report that's used for job order costing and for process costing over here, we have our job cost sheet for job order costing. Remember, the job cost sheet shows at the summary level our total materials, total labor, and total overhead for a job. And over here, we have by department on the production report. Okay, a production report, which is something that we'll talk about in more detail in a subsequent later lecture video. Okay? For now, just know that we track it by our production report. In terms of the number, in terms of our unit costs, how do we calculate those? The cost per unit, we can say by job. So remember back what we did with job order costing. We're saying here's the total cost of the job. Okay? And then over here, again, we can say by department on the production report. So our production report, as we will see later on, helps us to calculate our cost per unit. And we use our production report, and on that production report, we will calculate our cost per unit. Moving on to the next page, right over here, in terms of the number of work in process accounts. Over here with job order, I'll give that a header. This one's process. We have one WIP account that we use, work in process account for job order. But over here with process, we have many. And in fact, what we have is for each processing department, we have a WIP account. So I'll rephrase that a different way. Each processing department has its own work and processing account. Okay, so if we had two processing departments, think about that: soap maker, mixing and packaging, we would have whip mixing and then whip packaging. Okay, so why don't you take a second and pause the video and go ahead and do these quick check problems, 1, 2, 3, 4, through the next page, and then we'll come back and we'll see how you did. Okay? Hello and welcome back. And so let's go ahead and see how you did on these quick check problems. So with process costing is going to be used for products that are similar and produced continuously. Okay? Different, that implies job order. Okay? Individual units to customer specifications, that implies job order. Purchase from vendors doesn't make any sense in this context. Okay? Which one of the following characteristics, and it could be multiple, as you see, is associated with process costing? Heterogeneous or different products would be job order costing. Homogeneous or similar products, that is process costing. Continuous production, we look back at that, what our description of process costing, we said it relies upon continuous and uniform production, and then we also said that the costs are traced to processing departments. And look at number 3, the best example of a business that would be using a process costing would be a soap maker. Look at some of these. Custom, that means job order. Antique, furniture restore. Everybody has a different antique. And then what you're going to do is if you have to bring in your antique to a furniture restore, they're going to give you a ticket and they're going to show this is how much it costs us in terms of materials to fix up your antique, how much it costs us in terms of labor to fix up your antique. So what are they doing? They're tracking their time and the materials to fix your antique. That your antique in that situation is the job. Okay? So this would be more of a job order costing idea. Same idea with an automobile repair shop. That would also be job order costing. If you had your car repaired, they track the cost to fix your car, right? Buy your car. They say, this is, your muffler was out, we had to buy a new muffler. Here's the materials, the new muffler cost. And then it cost us 5 hours of labor to fix your muffler at $100 an hour. That's $500 of labor cost. We're assigning that to the job, which is fixing your car. Okay, so that would also be job order costing. Soap manufacturing is the one that I've talked about a couple times, where that would be using process costing because soap is identical or similar products. Yes, there's different types of soap, but it's still soap. It's not nearly as different as an automobile repair shop, where somebody might have a Virginia State inspection, somebody else has to have their muffler fixed. Those are two very, very different jobs. Still soap, not all that different. Okay? The cost in a process costing system are traced to, well, this is job order costing, not customers, not company administrators, but to specific production departments. Okay? We talk about the idea of process costing in some terms and concepts. When we talk about the idea of processing departments, that's what I was giving you that example of where we have a mixing department and then a packaging department. Those would be two examples of a processing department, mixing and packaging. And technically a processing department is any location or any department in the company where we add materials, labor, and overhead. And also the activities in that processing department have to be done uniformly on all those products. And as I said before, we would have a separate WIP account for mixing, and a separate work in process account for packaging, and we can add materials, labor, and overhead to each processing department. The other thing is that the total cost moves. So what we might have is WIP mixing goes to WIP packaging, and then maybe from there it goes to finished goods. So what's going to happen is when it's done mixed, we're going to transfer the cost from WIP mixing to WIP packaging, and then once it's done packaged, it goes to finished goods. But you can see we're going to be adding total costs over here as we go throughout this chain right here. Okay? So the next lecture video will start on transfer costs and then continue with more concepts. Thanks so much.